Hello, EPR 594, and welcome to our module on reviewing the literature. Thinking back to the research cycle that we explored earlier this semester, we're going to kind of keep that theme going throughout the semester as we move along through these different steps. We started, of course, with our research problem. What is the issue that we want to study? What is going on in the world that we think we need to stop and look at and explore, and hopefully, in an ideal world, be able to come up with a solution on how to solve that. Once we have that problem, we don't immediately go into writing up a research question and starting to do a study. The first thing we want to do after coming up with that problem, which is step one, we notice a problem. The first thing we want to do after that is to go to the literature. We do this for a lot of different reasons. One, there could be answers already out there in the literature, so we want to see what's going on out there. And two, if it is something that we're going to do a study on, we don't want to go into that study blind. We want to have some kind of background, some kind of information that we can use and approach that from an informed perspective. So for this module, we're going to talk a little bit about why we do a review of the literature, what's involved with it, and a few ideas on going about that process. So we're starting off with, we have our research problem selected, now what, right? Tons of research problems out there. Different things could be student performance if you are in education, for example, obesity rates, different health disparities that currently exist if you're in community health or if you're in kinesiology. All of these are relevant research problems for study. However, we want to make sure that we are familiar with the previous material, that we're knowledgeable about our topic, and that we're going in as an expert, not only in our content to see what's already out there, but also an expert in what has already been done so that we can know how to set up our own study and do it in the most rigorous way possible. So why do we do that literature review? The purpose of that literature review is to serve really a variety of ideas in that research design process. A thorough review of the literature brings us closer to becoming an expert on the topic, which allows us to do a few different things. The first is potentially find previous studies on similar subjects. Maybe somebody has already done a study on this particular problem that you have. Maybe there's tons of solutions to that problem already. Maybe we are looking to see how maybe nobody has done it in our particular area. So let's say maybe they haven't done it in Alabama, but they've done similar studies in other countries. So we can see how they've done it, what findings they have. We can see what other studies are maybe on similar topics to see how it relates to what it is that we're doing. Another option is to recognize gaps in the literature that should be studied. This is where we find that maybe somebody hasn't studied our particular topic or they haven't studied it in our area. So in this first one here, finding previous studies not only helps us understand the context and the field that we're going into, but also might help us find the answer to the problem that we're looking at. The second one is whenever maybe somebody hasn't solved that particular problem. So maybe it's something new. There's a lot of conversation about AI in education right now. Maybe there's something that people haven't studied in that area yet. We also saw this when COVID-19 picked up, that there was a lot that we just didn't know about how, from a sociological standpoint, how people were going to react, how people were going to deal with this idea of a pandemic and lockdowns and quarantines. Also, kind of how does the modern world function within those restrictions? And so there were a lot of gaps in the literature at that point that we could fill with our research. And so ideally, whenever we publish something, we want to look for how are we adding to that conversation. So first two reasons, finding previous studies so that we can become acquainted with the content. Two, finding gaps in the literature to see what hasn't been studied so that we can fill those gaps in the literature. A third purpose of the literature review is to familiarize ourselves with relevant variables and begin to hypothesize about their relationships. So whenever I'm going into a study, especially if I'm doing an experimental design, which we will visit in a few weeks, about what that looks like and what makes an experimental design a true experiment, one of the things that we're going to look at are going to be variables and setting up a hypothesis or an estimate, a guess, or something that we're looking to explore further. We don't really just pull those out of thin air, we pull those from the literature. The literature is going to tell us what's already been done, which will then help us understand What variables could potentially influence this topic? How do I measure those variables? We're going to talk about something called operationalization when we get to the experimental modules. In operationalization, we're talking about how do I measure something? So maybe I measure weight using a scale, right? But then there's things that are more complicated, like motivation. How do I measure motivation and self-esteem? All of that is going to come from the literature review. It's going to help us determine how to do that. And then hypothesizing or setting up a hypothesis about the relationships between these variables. The literature is going to tell us kind of what we should expect based on previous patterns of research. And then in our particular study, we're going to see, do we find the same things or not? Is there something else that's missing from that? And so how to set up that study, what to expect, how to measure the variables in that study, which variables are potentially relevant and which ones maybe aren't, are all part of that literature review process. And then finally, situating ourselves and our studies within the broader research community. We just want to see what's already out there so we know how do we see ourselves and how do we place ourselves in that discussion. Think of the literature that already exists as a big conversation that's just happening in your field, that's happening with people that study things like what you're studying or what you're going into studying. And you're wanting to engage with that conversation. What are people saying about this topic? What factors are influencing certain things? From a practitioner standpoint, we can also see how these things are intertwined so that we can inform our own practice. Maybe we're not interested in doing research, but maybe we're interested in working with athletes, or maybe we're interested in trying some new literacy program at our school. We want to see, what does the literature say works? Let's see. After we have our literature review kind of understood, we want to actually start digging into it, right? If you've ever gone into the library or if you've ever opened EBSCOhost or Academic Search Premier or JSTOR, any of those search engines that really focus on this type of content, looking at the literature, looking at articles and everything, you will quickly notice that there are a ton of them. So where do we even get started, especially if we're new to a field and we don't really know who our major authors are, we don't really know what we're getting into. I absolutely relate to this whenever I do a lot of qualitative work. Sometimes it's in a topic or an area that I don't know anything about. This happened a lot with COVID because I typically don't work in health. But with COVID, I was asked to help collect data and analyze data for a lot of health-related type topics. And that was so far out of my normal repertoire that I did have to do a lot of digging. And it was very intimidating jumping into that, not knowing where to start or what to look for. So I always tell students, this is what we do. This is the same thing that you're going to do. Begin with the basics. 3 good strategies include looking to strong authors. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Examining related variables and examining the topic from the general to the specific. And we're going to talk about all of these one by one and how they impact how you do your lit review. So the first one is looking to strong authors. A great place to start your search is to pull popular articles in the field. One of the things I recommend is to dig into Google Scholar a little bit. Of course, when you're doing your actual formal lit review, you want to go into the library. They're going to have better information. They're going to have more access to things. Google Scholar, what I do think it offers that at the time of me recording this video, the library doesn't offer, is Google Scholar will show you cited by. Let me see if I can open up this image a little bit bigger. But when you go into Google Scholar, that is the cloudiest image ever. When you go into Google Scholar and you type in a topic, and by Google Scholar, literally just go into Google and type Google Scholar and it'll pull it up. And it limits what comes through Google to specifically things that would be peer-reviewed research or sometimes white papers. So it's not guaranteed to be peer-reviewed research. But from this example right here, you can see the name of the article is up here, Journal of the American Chemical Society. So this is probably something chemistry or engineering related. There's a name of an author right here. It's got a date that looks like 1931 or 1981. So it's a little old. But what I like about it is this piece right here where it says cited by, and it'll have a number. This one says 15,477. Related articles would be other things that have kind of cited similar things. And so one of the things that I think is really beneficial for students and for myself whenever I'm starting a new project is I will pull up the topic in Google Scholar. I will see who comes up to the top, who has the most citations. It's not a guarantee that that is the best person in the field to follow. Sometimes it's just a really old article that has just been around for so long and has been referenced so many times. But a lot of times, if it's a newer topic and it's somebody who's really well known in the field, or it's got some really profound findings, anything like that will typically influence that number to go up. So the number doesn't necessarily mean that it's a great article. However, this is all about kind of looking for clues to get started. And so a lot of times whenever you pull these up, if it's been cited by a lot of people, especially if it's recent and it's been cited by a lot of people, then it's probably a big part of the current discussion, and it'll give you some clues about getting into that discussion. The other thing I like about it is this related articles. It'll show you things that are similar. So Google Scholar will show you how many times it's been cited. Looking for articles with many citations will indicate a revered author or influential article. Usually, that's not a guarantee. And once you go into there, you can see who cited them. And you, by hitting this cited by 15,000, it'll show you all the other people who are currently writing who are citing this person. So it'll kind of give you those little breadcrumbs to follow in this field. The other thing that you can also look for is who did they cite? So pull up their article, read their article, because they might be citing somebody that they're criticizing. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they love this person if they're in their reference list. But go through that article, see who they're citing and who they are looking to as being experts in the field, and pull up those articles and kind of trace those authors. Once you find authors that are revered in the field, that are respected in the field, you can generally trust the sources that they're using as well to help yourself kind of find what some of these things are. You can also modernize it by seeing who is citing those articles, because this might be an article from 5 or 6 years ago, but somebody might be doing a study today where they're also citing this author. The second piece is to go in and to look for variables. So in this first one, maybe I just studied, I can't read what this says up here on this example, but let's say I just Googled health disparities, COVID or something like that. It will tell me who's talking the most about that at this particular point in time. Looking for variables might be specific things that I think might influence that particular topic. So I might want to search for those variables. I might also want to use those authors that I found in the previous step to see what variables they're looking at. So for example, teen pregnancy is a very broad term. There's lots of variables that influence teen pregnancy rates. As I go through these articles, I might want to see what are the same concepts that are getting repeated in these articles. So I found my articles that have been cited significantly. As you go through your field, you'll start learning which journals are just really top tier journals where they're the most stringent, they're the hardest to get into. So usually they're most selective in what they're publishing, and they're really publishing kind of cream of the crop kind of work. You can start going through those, as well as the journals that are in your professional field. In your professional organization. So for example, American Educational Research Association is probably the most prominent field for education research. It's very broad in what they cover, but if it's been published in the AERA journal, you can really expect it to be kind of top tier, really quality work. And so I can look to those articles and I can see what are they doing, who are they citing, what variables are they looking at. What things do they see that are influencing teen pregnancy, for example, or literacy rates or something like that? I want to see what those variables are. Make a list of kind of my own keywords or topics that I think are related to my main topic, teen pregnancy, for example. And then I can search those particular variables and see what people are saying about those specific variables. Because I don't want to just learn about teen pregnancy by itself. I want to learn about all these different variables that are going to influence teen pregnancy. All of that is part of the conversation. They're part of the context. And if I'm doing something that's more quantitative, they're going to be important for me to be able to measure and see how other people are discussing it. The third strategy that we're going to look at is really going from the general to the specific. Whenever we're jumping into a new topic, we probably don't know that much about the specifics of the topic. Or if we start going down the rabbit hole of the specifics of the topic, we might miss the bigger picture of what's going on in that particular topic, in that discussion at this time. So we want to look at our topic on a broad scale and then narrow it down to our local situation or our more specific situation. So for example, in the teen pregnancy case, we might want to discuss the topic at the national level. So What are we talking about teen pregnancy broadly speaking? And then we might want to go to our specific region, maybe specifically the US, and then from US teen pregnancy specifically down to Alabama, and see what are the specific issues in Alabama. Because one of the things that we'll notice is a lot of these things, they're not a monolith. We are not going to have the same issues affecting teen pregnancy in Poland, for example, might not be the same things that are affecting it in the US. There might be some differences between those two. And that would be an example of a gap in the literature that we're looking to fill if it hasn't been conducted in a particular area. So the same works with our topics. Say you're interested in teen pregnancy and dropouts. We want to start with teen pregnancy and related issues such as low-income backgrounds, early sexual activity, having teen mothers. All of these are things that at the time of the article that I used to cite for this were factors that were influencing teen pregnancy rates, and then I will focus on my particular topic. So maybe I start with teen pregnancy risk factors, just looking at all of them. Maybe I focus in on low self-esteem as a specific risk factor. And then within that, I notice that maybe the literature is talking about there's some kind of correlation between low self-esteem and coming from an abusive household that might influence or be correlated with higher rates of teen pregnancy. And so that gives me something that's very specific that I want to look into, because when I'm doing a study, I want to be very specific about what I'm doing. And once we get into all the limitations within validity and limitations of experimental, quantitative, and qualitative studies, we'll really see why it's so important to be very specific about what we're doing. At that point, I have all of my literature. I really want to dig into this literature. There's a lot of it that you start reading. You might use a little bit. You might use a lot of it. You might totally throw away the article, or that article might be your best friend. So just because it's on your topic doesn't mean it's useful. I'm not going to lie, it's a tedious process putting together a literature review. However, if you've done a really solid literature review, you will walk away from that not only being really well versed and prepared to do a study if you're doing a study, but also you're going to be somewhat of an expert in that area. By really immersing yourself in what is already out there, you're able to have those discussions with people. And in the case of doing a dissertation, you are able to propose why that your research is important and really refine your research problem and make your research question something that's relevant and is informed by what is already out there in the field. Now that we have all of that together, we want to write our literature review. You will see a literature review at the beginning of pretty much any article that you will pull up. It will be at the beginning of a dissertation in chapter 2. Once we find, digging into our literature, that we're not really finding anything new, a lot of the articles that we're finding are kind of repeating the same thing that we've read in previous articles. We're not learning about new variables. We're not learning about new contexts. We're seeing a lot of things that are just kind of corroborating our original findings. We can still use that in our literature review, but it's a pretty good sign that we've looked at what is all out there. We're never going to be able to read everything on our topic, so please don't stress that that's an expectation for your dissertation. You are supposed to be well read in the area. You're not expected to have read everything in the area. So we want to make sure we're at a point where we can fully define all of our concepts and our variables. If there's any theory that we want to use, we want to be well versed in that theory. And then we're going to put together the actual literature review, which is really that narrative that you'll see at the beginning of articles and research studies. When we structure that document, we can start with an outline. We pull it together, general introduction of the articles, move on to more specific. That same process of, we're going to start with the very general topic, explain why it's a problem, explain what's already been done out there, and then slowly narrow it down to your particular topic. I do want to point out that, like most things, there is no one-size-fits-all approach to writing a literature review. If it's something that you're working on right now or you're interested in, I really recommend you just kind of being mindful and paying attention to how they're structured while you're reading the articles for your literature review, so you can kind of see what is included in there, how did people set it up. It might deviate a little bit in different fields depending on what the problem is that you're proposing and the design that you're working with. So every time I've done a lit review, it's always looked a little bit different. So always go with whatever strategy and whatever format you think helps you best discuss and present the information that you have and make a case for the need for your study, the research problem, and why you set up your study. I've also included some additional links in the module after this. They're optional, but you can review them to see more examples of how other people have approached a literature review and other information that you can use if that's something that is in your future. Other things to remember that are incredibly important whenever you're thinking about the literature review is that peer review is everything. Peer review means that an article was submitted to a group of fellow experts in the field and judged for quality. These should form the basis of your literature review. So, whenever I publish an article, the expectation for UAB and most universities is that you're publishing in peer reviewed journals in your area. And what that means is that after I write a manuscript, I submit it to the editor of whatever journal is the best fit for the study that I'm doing. They will review it, see if it's a good fit for their journal. And if they do think it's a good fit for their journal, then they will send it to their reviewers who will essentially look over the content, look over my methods, look over the relevance to the field, make sure that it's a quality study, make sure that I did it within the expectations of rigor in my field, and that it's relevant to that content of what I'm looking at, that I'm not just some random person off the street that wrote up a big narrative and slapped it in there. There's a lot of things that you can find on the internet, as I'm sure you are familiar with, where somebody says, yeah, I did this and I looked into this and this is what I found. It doesn't necessarily mean that what they did meets the scientific rigor that we're looking for. And so whenever we're looking at a journal article, we want to look at the quality of the journal, which I'll talk about in just a second on number 2, but we want to make sure that it's peer reviewed. And whenever you do searches at the UAB library website, as well as searches through Google Scholar, there's typically an option in there in the search settings and everything where you can click the box that says peer reviewed, and it will only pull up articles that are peer reviewed. Let's see. Number 2, not all journals are created equal. Some journals are more highly regarded than others, so be sure to include higher tier journals in your literature review mix. Now, that's not to say that things that are published in lower tier journals are bad or wrong. That's not the case at all. Maybe those other journals just don't have the same level of readership. Maybe they don't have, you can look at something called an impact factor, which will tell you kind of how much that article is cited, or how much that journal is cited, would be more accurate. To see, how big of a role is that particular journal playing in the discourse that's happening in your field at that time. We want to look to journals that are published by our professional organizations. So I mentioned the American Educational Research Association. There's tons of them in health and kinesiology. Nature is probably one of the hardest journals in the world to get into, and they publish a lot of science-related work in that journal. And so the more strict, or the lower the acceptance rate of a journal, typically the more the higher ranked or the higher revered that journal is. Typically, that's not a one size fits all either. But whenever we're looking at that, we want to make sure that what we're finding in those lower tier journals are also kind of replicated or similar to what we're seeing in those higher tier journals, because we want to make sure that what we're reading in those lower tier journals is quality work, and that it's not in a lower tier journal just because it wasn't as rigorous as what was in the other pieces. Let's see. So a good little mix. Again, that doesn't mean that you can't use stuff from a lower tier journal. I use stuff from lower tier journals all the time. A lot of times it's because maybe somebody did a pilot study, and because it's a pilot study, it didn't make it into one of the higher tier journals, but their findings are really fascinating and really relevant to what it is that I'm doing. So it doesn't mean that it's a bad study. What we want to really make sure of is that we're looking for peer review and that it's being held to a high standard. We don't want to cite something from Bob's Bargain Basement journal that he publishes on his website through a WordPress or something. We want to look to something that's actually been reviewed by experts in the field. Number 3, stay current. It's okay to have a few older works if they are considered cornerstones of the field. Otherwise, a good kind of general rule is to try to keep your sources within the last 5 years. You might find that some authors go a little bit further. Some authors focus on something that's more recent. If you're doing dissertation, your chair or your field might have its own kind of rules about this. We're a very multidisciplinary group whenever we're taking this course. And so I hate to give everybody a one size fits all, but generally within the last 5 years is what I hear most often, with some deviations from that. So let's say you're using an article that's really kind of the foundation of your field. If you're in education and you're doing something with Piaget, for example, you will probably cite something that Piaget has written, which obviously is a long time ago, from 5 years. If you're doing something with critical theory, you might cite Foucault or Gloria Ladson-Billings or something. in those areas that may also be more than 5 years old. So we just want to make sure that we have a good reason for citing it. You can see the relevance of this, of course, if we're talking about using computers in training to motivate people, how novel computers were, and we'll talk about novelty as an issue in research, impacting research when we get to validity. But if we want to think about the role that that played in, let's say, the 1990s, kids would be way more excited about doing stuff on the computer than they would now because they have computers in their pockets, they have phones, they have computers all over the place. It's not as new and engaging as it was for them many years ago, right? So what we know about using computers in the classroom as a way to motivate students from the 90s or the early 2000s probably wouldn't apply to today. And so whenever it comes to things like that, we want to make sure that we're looking at the most recent research. And then finally, always use proper citations. We're going to talk about citations and plagiarism and all that good stuff in an APA video. For the majority of education in the social sciences, we use APA. I do understand that kinesiology uses something different, as do other fields, history, all that good stuff. So whenever you see citations that I'm using, they're going to be using APA just because that's the most common within our disciplines collectively. But we do want to make sure that we give credit to who has already proposed this information, where we got this information from our literature review, and then delineate where that stops and where our contributions begin. So that is all I have on introducing the literature review. I do encourage you to go into the module, look at the additional optional pieces that are in there if this is something that you're working on or if you need more information. And as always, feel free to email me at any time. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions you have about the literature review. I know this is kind of a quick and dirty run through, so let me know if you have any questions. I'll be happy to answer them, and I will see you all online.